Borderline personality disorders. This YouTube is primarily for those interested in how diagnoses are given, and for those that are given this diagnosis. If you have been given a borderline personality disorder, you might enjoy this discussion. Personality disorders usually compose the bulk of individuals seeking private psychiatric or counseling assistance. The beauty of personality disorders is that there is no conceivable individual who cannot be diagnosed or as having an access to personality disorder. Most admitting clinicians usually prefer to write diagnoses deferred on access to. However, private clinicians relish the personality disorder criteria. The most commonly used diagnoses for an individual exhibiting marked facial expressions, chronic anxiety, and frustrated personal life is borderline personality disorder. Another significant characteristic of borderline disorders is a chronic pained expression that is definitely a part of their features and is not ameliorated by pharmaceutical intervention. Borderlines will go to any and all extents to cover their family, their personal affairs, and themselves. It is my estimation that a functioning borderline personality is not detectable except for their facial expression. This pained expression, when confronted, changes to one of intense hostility and frightening controlled aggression. A personality disorder of this magnitude is capable of any and all actions necessary to preserve what the borderline personality perceives as its personal integrity. A true borderline personality oftentimes is combined with what laymen may consider genius intellect. However, what is missing is any conceivable development of conscience. A true borderline considers morality only in reference to himself and those he chooses to protect as necessary. When they cease to be necessary to his cover, they become expendable. For obvious reasons, again, it is my estimation that this disorder not be lightly diagnosed. Although I have not surveyed studies of bizarre criminal activity with individuals who were labeled borderline, it is something usually accepted as fact by clinicians that of all the personality disorders listed in the diagnostic manual, borderlines are most capable of such activity and most capable of directing a very believable cover for their activities. Let us take the case of Ted. He is a dentist, divorced, with children who are living with his ex-wife. Ted lives with his parents. First contact, Ted presented a professional exterior suit, tie, shirt, polished. His first interview is extremely congenial, and Ted is very cooperative. His history is one of his perception of being used and maligned by those he has condescended to love. Those he has condescended to love. He is adamant in stating that his financial condition has deteriorated from his previous life with his ex-wife. As a dentist, he claims to have earned in excess of $1 million. Currently, he is barely making ends meet on at least $2,000 a month from various insurance companies. He begins to relax, and his smile is perceptibly pleasant. The clinician closes the first interview with a diagnosis of chronic anxiety and leads Ted through a series of breathing exercises and visualization techniques. Ted leaves almost buoyant. Succeeding visits become commonplace. However, although a significant dose of Zoloft is prescribed, the pain expression around his eyes remains. On his fourth or fifth session, the clinician refers him again to a psychiatrist for re-evaluation of his medication. Later, the clinician is accosted by the psychiatrist, who vehemently makes his point that the therapist should refrain from referring this client, Ted, to him. The last session arranged by the therapist with Ted is one of testing his diagnoses. Again, Ted is professionally dressed, congenial. However, this time he remembers his last visit with his psychiatrist, and this time he does not come to her clinic alone. He brings a friend. While the interview is progressing, the therapist deliberately confronts Ted. His reaction, pained expression, miraculously drops. Control is amazing. He starts to his feet and gradually, with a low, frightening, calm voice, approaches the clinician and very casually asserts as he is coming near, "You never cared about me." Whether or not this was transference or directed towards the clinician herself, the situation was possibly volatile. The therapist, just as casually, got up, picked up the phone, and called out. Ted backed off, but his facial expressions were one of complex emotions, visible on the face. If the clinician had reacted with any form of even implied retaliation, Ted could have been aggressive. The only possible reaction was one of aloof detachment, meeting Ted at eye level and calling out to indicate that the clinician was not alone. The situation with Ted at that particular session ended with the clinician escorting Ted to the psychiatrist's office and staying with him during his evaluation. Ted was once again congenial, cooperative, and anxious to be helped. Borderline personality disorders appeals to some clinicians as the last resort in diagnosing troublesome, erratic, and definitely unappreciative clients. However, much of the etiology of the above-listed symptoms can be considered natural reaction to a patient's frustration with his situation. True borderline personalities are the most hostile of all personality disorders. This hostility is covert, insidious, and never wanes. In considering the case of Ted, a true borderline personality, we cannot ignore the prognosis for his future. Ted will be on medication and treatment with no appreciable change in his condition. He will float from clinician to clinician and will develop no complete or even partial connection with any therapist. Since this connection that is necessary for even any partial healing is almost definitely never reached by a true borderline. Even an attempt at normalizing will be denied him. That is not to say that he cannot function relative to his personal needs. However, Ted, at that stage, will never regain a healthy mental balance that he may have had prior to onset of his disorder. Borderline personalities can and do function some in very significant areas of society. That particular disorder, if coupled with astute coping mechanisms, either taught or miraculously self-imposed, does not prohibit that individual from functioning. Usually they will go out of their way to appear calm, collected, focused, and oblivious to anyone else's situation. Their entire life is based on their own personal survival. A psychic, in the order that some borderline personalities might perhaps have visited before seeking professional help, might perceive in a borderline personality disorder a possessed spirit. And that is one of the frightening symptomology of true borderline personalities. Some borderline personalities might even have resorted to a seance. A seance in his level is best performed privately. The current prognosis with borderline personalities is that their visual manifestations outweigh their mental acuity and their obvious psychic gifts. A true borderline personality functions on two levels. The visible level is the pained expression around his eyes, and the unseen mental level is that area, that gray area that is his mind, that can create something out of nothing and present it as fact and tell you that that fact is real. It would be my opinion that most personality disorders are not genetic controlled, although a genetic tendency might be inherent. Family denial of reality, societal denial of reality can and does induce in the human organism coping behaviors that in the long run escalate to severe mental disorders. An interesting point in connection is the comparable symptoms of schizophrenia and borderline personality disorders. Although the obvious difference in axis coding and the biological changes in schizophrenia, the intense, complete acceptance of delusional aberrations as fact, as being real, is almost identical to both diseases. And we can call here a borderline personality as having a disease, even though it is coded as a personality disorder. What I find of particular interest is the Axis 2 coding of personality disorders is the obvious ideological suppositions. Axis 1 diagnoses are restricted to pervasive mental health disorders, whose prognosis is one of long-term impaired functioning. Axis 2 disorders are restricted to behaviors that may appear odd, eccentric, out of the norm, but may or may not impair long-term functioning. It is my estimation that most criminal behaviors arise from unsuspected functioning personality disorders. An individual so afflicted is often under intense personal need to cover, shield, and at all costs deny any form of aberration. Usually, most personality disorders are diagnosed in conjunction with Axis 1 disorders. An undiagnosed functioning individual afflicted with a personality disorder usually has erected a visible personal space structure, extreme congeniality, acquiescence to the most absurd form of denial, a very intense awareness of self and the self one is projecting, and often signs off undiagnosed and possibly criminal personality disorders. To distinguish personality disorders from perfunctory psychoses, one would have to consider the exhibiting symptoms of the individual's day-to-day psychotic projections, facial distortions, delusions, self-emaciating behaviors, inability to tend to one's personal needs, incapacitating projections of reality are some symptoms to consider. None of these are involved with a true personality disorder of the magnitude of a true borderline. It is obvious then that a borderline whose perception of his life space, which he considers of utmost importance to and superseding all others in importance, is that of being threatened, will do whatever he feels is necessary to preserve himself, his ego, and his perception of his needs. The clinicians dealing with such a client may inadvertently uncover information that, depending on the legal and ethical conditions of his profession, will take some confidential discussion with a valued and knowledgeable professional as to risk potential and need to be informed. Also, personal risk potential to the clinician himself must be considered. It is inadvisable to confront such an individual in a private clinician's setting unless one is prepared to lose that client. Direct confrontation of such an individual could lead to direct physical violence. Such an individual, if he considers himself as boxed in or discovered, usually reaches out to his network of associates, which means that the direct violence may not happen at the office setting, but might happen elsewhere. Such criminal acts as hit and run automobile accidents, phone threats, stalking, theft, etc. are not uncommon and are usually normative to that individual's behavior. Bizarre and seemingly purposeless crimes, if traced with an open mind, may reveal tangents that can uncover the cause. The complication in dealing with such an extraordinary individual lies not so much in his own power, but in the threat he poses to those who may wittingly or unwittingly have become confederates to his criminal behavior and subsequent cover-ups. To flush that kind of individual into the open requires persistent, directed, focused attention entirely on him and subduing of his confederates with minimal threat. To the clinician, if the need to inform has extended itself. What antagonizes such an individual more than a perceptive clinician who may have unearthed his secrets is to publicly make conscious of that fact. To mimic his secretive criminal behavior antagonizes him into confrontation. But like any good general, he sends his troops out first, which gives the clinician time to deal with such exigencies. The psychology of such a mind is perhaps the most difficult because of the legal distractions made between sane and insane behaviors. Commonly accepted definitions and behaviors of insanity are not applicable to such an individual, and yet, if separated from his confederates and flushed out into making his own actions, his behavior will reenact the most violent part of his psyche that engendered his very real psychoses. If stripped of his cloak of secrecy and confederate protection, his private and personal behaviors will have no recourse but to flower, be seen, and possibly remedied clinically, legally, or both. I hope that discussion on personality disorders is, especially borderline personality disorders, was helpful.